bonds aren't broken with a whisper. They are torn out by the roots. When Caelan stood in the freezing mud of the courtyard and declared he was taking another as his Luna, the pain didn't just break Mabel's heart. It snapped her spine. She didn't cry. She bled. This is a story about the brutal arithmetic of power, a shattered mate bond, and the day the Alpha King himself walked into a miserable village and decided he wanted the scraps. The mud of the Winterbourne courtyard was half-frozen, jagged ridges of dirt that bit through the thin soles of her boots. It was late November, the kind of cold that settles in your marrow and refuses to leave. She stood in the center of the square. Around her the pack formed a loose, silent ring. 300 wolves, their breath pluming in the grey air, their eyes fixed on the spectacle. They smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and anticipation. Above all, they smelled of pity. Mabel hated the pity more than the cold. Caelan stood 10 paces away. He looked exactly as he had the night they first kissed behind the tanner's shed 3 years ago. Broad shoulders wrapped in a thick bear pelt cloak, a sharp jawline dusted with dark stubble, and eyes the colour of bruised thunder. But the warmth that usually lived in those eyes was gone. In its place was a flat, unyielding pragmatism. Beside him stood Rowena. She didn't look at Mabel. Her gaze was fixed somewhere over Mabel's left shoulder, her chin tilted up just enough to catch the pale winter sun. She wore deep crimson wool, lined with snow fox fur, a stark contrast to Mabel's worn leather tracking breeches and stained tunic. She was the daughter of the northern warlord. She brought 50 seasoned warriors, 3 iron mines, and a bloodline of pure, unbroken alphas. Mabel brought a good bow and a knack for tracking elk in a blizzard. The arithmetic was simple. Caelan was the new alpha of Winterbourne. His father had died 2 moons ago in a border skirmish, leaving the pack vulnerable, poor, and starving. Caelan needed power. He needed an alliance. The moon goddess had given him Mabel as a fated mate, but Caelan had always been a man who preferred maps and treaties to the whims of the gods. Mabel. His voice cut through the biting wind. It didn't waver. That hurt worse than if he had shouted. Say it and get it over with, Caelan. She replied. Her voice sounded thin, raspy. She kept her hands balled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms so hard she felt the warm, sudden slip of her own blood. Focus on the physical pain. Anchor to it. He frowned just a fraction. A flicker of annoyance that she wasn't making this easier, that she wasn't playing the part of the weeping, discarded female. I, Caelan of House Winterbourne, Alpha of the Western Ridge. He began the ancient formal words tumbling from his lips like stones dropping into a dry well. Do hereby reject Mabel the Tracker as my fated mate. I sever the bond of blood, of bone, and of spirit. I claim Rowena of the North as my chosen Luna. He didn't blink. He didn't hesitate. The severing of a mate bond is rarely described accurately in the old songs. The bards sing of a poetic heartache, a gentle fading of light. They are liars. It hit her like a battle-axe to the chest. The air rushed out of her lungs in a violent heave. Her knees buckled. She hit the frozen mud hard, the impact jarring her teeth, but she barely felt it over the sudden, catastrophic tearing inside her chest. It felt as though a rusted hook had been embedded in her ribcage, and a team of draft horses had violently pulled it free. A strangled, wet gasp tore its way out of her throat. She pressed both hands to the dirt, staring at the frost-rimed pebbles, fighting the overwhelming urge to vomit. Her wolf, the primal spirit that shared her soul, howled a sound of sheer, unadulterated agony that echoed only in her own skull. The beast slammed against the confines of Mabel's mind, scratching, bleeding, dying a little in the dark. Mabel. It was an elder's voice. Garrick. He stepped forward from the crowd, holding out a weathered hand. Don't. She choked out the word, tasting of copper and bile. She squeezed her eyes shut, panting through the waves of excruciating hot pain radiating from her sternum. She forced herself to look up. Kalen was watching her. His jaw was tight, a muscle ticking wildly in his cheek. His wolf was fighting him, she could see it in the slight tremor of his hands. He was feeling the echo of the severing, the backlash of rejecting a soul the universe had stitched to his. But his human mind, his cold, calculating ambition, was holding his beast by the throat. He reached out and took Rowena's hand. That simple gesture was the final cut. The bond, already stretched to the point of breaking, snapped completely. A ringing silence fell over the courtyard. The invisible tether that had connected her mind to his, the hum of his presence, the ambient warmth of his existence vanished. She was entirely, completely alone in her own head. The sudden emptiness was terrifying. It was a cavernous void, cold and echoing. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. Mabel planted her boots in the mud, ignored the trembling in her thighs, and forced herself to stand. She wiped a streak of dirt and spit from her chin with the back of a bloody hand. She looked at Kalen, past the guilt he was trying to hide, past the false stoicism. "I accept your rejection, Alpha Kalen," she said, her voice dead and flat. "May your reign be as cold as your word." She turned her back on him. She turned her back on the murmuring crowd, on the pitying stares, and walked toward the tree line. Every step felt like walking on shattered glass, her chest a hollow, bleeding drum. She didn't look back. If she looked back, she would shatter, and she refused to leave Kalen the satisfaction of sweeping up her pieces. The winter that followed was the harshest Winterbourne had seen in a generation. The snow fell in thick, suffocating blankets, burying the valleys, and turning the ancient pine forests into a monolithic, silent tomb. It suited her perfectly. She moved into an abandoned hunting cabin 3 miles from the main settlement. It was barely more than rotting logs and a drafty stone hearth, but it had a roof, and more importantly, it wasn't the village. The first 3 weeks were a blur of fever and delirium. Severed wolves often die of the shock. The immune system crashes, the spirit withers, and the body simply follows suit. Mabel spent days curled on a pallet of dry straw, shivering violently under a mountain of furs, sweating through her clothes while her wolf mourned in the darkest corners of her mind. She refused to speak to her. She refused to eat. She simply curled into a tight, bleeding ball and waited to die. But Mabel was too stubborn to die. Anger is a remarkably effective fuel when joy has burned away. She forced herself up. She forced herself to chew dried venison that tasted like ash. She forced herself to chop wood until her palms were a landscape of ruptured blisters, the physical exertion the only thing loud enough to drown out the silence in her head. By the 2nd month, the fever broke. She was thinner, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut, and there was a new, heavy coldness in her eyes. She returned to her work. She was a tracker. The pack still needed to eat regardless of what their alpha had done to her. She spent her days in the deep woods. She learned to read the snow, the faint depression of a hare's paw, the snapped twig of a passing elk, the lingering scent of fear on the frozen wind. She killed cleanly and efficiently. Once a week she dragged a sled laden with meat to the edge of the village, took her payment in salt arrows and silence, and retreated back to the trees. She heard the gossip, of course. Pack minds are leaky things, and the women at the trading post lacked volume control. Kalen and Rowena's mating ceremony had been a grand affair. The northern warlord had sent wagons of ale and roasted meats. Rowena was already carrying the first pup. Kalen was negotiating a trade route that would make Winterbourne wealthy. He was a good alpha, a strong leader. He made the right choice for the pack, they whispered as she walked past, dragging a freshly bled buck. It's a tragedy, yes. But look at us now. We are safe. She felt nothing. The wound in her chest had scarred over, leaving thick, numb tissue. She didn't hate Kalen anymore. You can only hate something you still care about. To her, he was just the man who ran the village, but the quiet rhythm of her isolation shattered in late February. She was at the trading post swapping 3 fox pelts for a new skinning knife when old Garrick pinned a parchment to the community board. His hands were shaking. A murmur ran through the gathered wolves, quickly escalating into a frantic, panicked buzz. "What is it?" she asked the merchant, a stout man named Silas, as he inspected her pelts. Silas swallowed hard, his eyes wide. "The king. The Alpha King is coming." Mabel paused, her thumb testing the edge of the new iron knife. "King Valerius here. We're a border territory. He hasn't ridden this far south in a decade. He's enforcing the decennial tithe personally this year," Silas whispered, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the freezing temperature. "Rumor has it there's unrest in the eastern territories. He's touring the packs, reminding everyone who holds the leash. He arrives in 3 days. A chill that had nothing to do with the wind rushed down her spine. The Alpha King of Ethelgard, a myth walking in flesh. Valerius was a warlord of a different breed, a man who had conquered the warring wolf factions 50 years ago, and forged them into a brutal, unified kingdom through sheer force of will and an ocean of spilled blood. He was old ancient by wolf standards, yet unkillable. Kaelin is ordering a grand feast." Silas continued, packing up his wares with frantic haste. "Every wolf must attend. Mandatory presence. No exceptions, Mabel. The king's guards will sweep the woods. If you're hiding, they'll take it as an insult to the crown." She looked toward the dark tree line of her home. 3 days. She could pack her sled and disappear over the ridge, risk the feral rogues in the deep mountains. But running from Valerius was a death sentence. His trackers were legends. She sheathed the knife. "Fine. I'll attend." She didn't care about the king. She didn't care about politics. She just wanted to survive the night, pay her respects, and go back to her quiet, frozen life. She didn't know the moon goddess wasn't done with her yet. She hadn't broken her for sport. She had cleared the foundation to build something terrifying. The Great Hall of Winterborn was a suffocating cavern of stone, fire, and anxiety. Normally it was a cavernous, drafty space where they held winter councils. Tonight it was packed shoulder to shoulder with 300 terrified, sweating wolves. Fires roared in the massive hearths, roasting whole boars and turning the air thick with the smell of grease, pine resin, and fear. Tapestries had been beaten clean and hung to hide the crumbling mortar. Everyone wore their finest heavy wools, dyed with madder root-polished silver torques, furs brushed until they gleamed. Mabel wore her cleanest tunic, a dark, heavy weave of charcoal grey, and her leather tracking boots. She stood at the very back of the hall, wedged into a shadowed alcove near the kitchen draughts. She wanted to be invisible. At the high table on a raised dais, Kaelin and Rowena sat. Kaelin looked regal, wearing a mantle of dark wolf fur, a silver circlet resting on his brow. He looked like an alpha. But she could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped nervously against his goblet. Rowena sat beside him, her hands resting protectively over the slight swell of her belly, draped in northern silks that looked ridiculous in their brutal climate. A heavy, sudden thud echoed from the massive oak doors at the end of the hall. The chatter died instantly. The silence was absolute, suffocating. Even the fires seemed to crackle quieter. The doors groaned open. The wind howled into the room, bringing a swirl of snow and the scent of the king's guard. 30 warriors marched in first. They wore blackened steel armor and bore the crest of Ethelgard, a roaring wolf wreathed in ash. They moved with a synchronized predatory grace that made the hairs on Mabel's arms stand up. They lined the walls, hands resting on the pommels of their broadswords. Then he walked in. King Valerius did not look like an old man. He looked like a mountain that had decided to walk. He was a head taller than any man in the room, broad-shouldered and heavily muscled, wrapped in a cloak of pure black bear fur. His hair was pitch dark, heavily streaked with iron grey at the temples, pulled back into a tight leather binding. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and old violence. A jagged scar ran from his left temple, down across his cheekbone, a souvenir from a war long finished. But it was his presence that crushed the air from the room. The aura of a normal alpha makes you want to lower your chin. Valerius's aura made Mabel's knees physically tremble. It was a crushing, overwhelming weight of ancient power, ancient blood. It tasted like ozone right before a lightning strike, sharp and terrifying. As he strode down the center aisle towards the dais, Kaelin immediately dropped to one knee, bowing his head. Rowena struggled to follow suit, clumsily kneeling in her silks. A wave followed them. 300 wolves dropped to the stone floor heads, bowed, exposing their necks in ultimate submission. Mabel knelt in her shadowed corner, pressing her forehead toward the cold stone, willing her erratic heartbeat to slow down. "Rise, Alpha Kaelin!" Valerius's voice boomed. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a baritone resonance that rattled the iron chandeliers. It sounded like grinding tectonic plates. Kaelin stood swallowing hard. "Welcome, my king. Winterborn is honored by your presence. We have prepared a feast, and the tithe is ready in the lower vaults." Valerius didn't look at the food. He didn't look at Rowena. His pale, predatory eyes, a startling, icy silver swept over Kaelin. "Your father was a competent man, Kaelin. Let us see if his pup inherited his teeth or just his bark." It was a casual insult, delivered with total indifference. Kaelin flushed but nodded tightly. "I strive to serve the crown, sire." "We shall see," Valerius murmured. He finally stepped up to the dais, taking the massive wooden throne that had been vacated for him. The feast began, though no one truly relaxed. The musicians played, but the lutes sounded frantic. People ate, but no one tasted the meat. The king's guards stood like statues watching the pack. Valerius sat at the high table, a goblet of dark wine in his massive hand, looking profoundly bored. He picked at a slab of venison, his silver eyes periodically scanning the hall. He looked like a man who had seen everything, conquered everything, and found it all deeply lacking. Mabel stayed in her corner, nursing a cup of watered-down ale. Her wolf, dormant and silent for months, suddenly stirred. It was faint at first. A twitch of the ears, a low rumble in the back of her mind. She frowned, setting the cup down. She rubbed her sternum where the scar tissue of the severed bond lay. It was aching. Not a sharp pain, but a deep, rhythmic throb. "Down," she told her wolf, pushing the feeling away. "Go to sleep." She didn't. She paced. She was agitated. And then the wind shifted. A servant opened a high window to let out the smoke, and a draught swept through the great hall, catching the air from the dais and pulling it toward the back of the room. The scent hit her. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a poetic realization. It was a physical blow. It smelled of dark pine crushed ice and the metallic tang of fresh blood. It bypassed her human brain entirely and struck the primal core of her soul. Her breath hitched. Her vision tunneled the edges, bleeding into black. Her wolf didn't just wake up. She slammed against the bars of her ribs, howling with a desperate, frantic need that Mabel had never felt in her life. Not even with Kaelin. Kaelin's bond had been a quiet stream. This was a tidal wave. Mate. The word ripped through her mind, loud and absolute. She gasped, stumbling back against the stone wall. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle the sound. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. No. No, this was a mistake. A cruel joke by a sadistic moon goddess. She was severed. She was broken. At the exact same moment on the dais, King Valerius froze. His goblet stopped halfway to his mouth. His head snapped up. The profound boredom vanished from his harsh features, replaced by a look of sheer predatory shock. His nostrils flared. The temperature in the room plummeted. The crushing weight of his alpha aura flared outward, suddenly violent and possessive. The musicians stopped playing abruptly, a lute string snapping with a sharp twang. Conversations died mid-sentence. Several weaker wolves in the front rows collapsed, whining in terror at the sudden spike in pressure. Kaelin stepped back, his hand dropping to his sword hilt out of sheer reflex. "My king, are we under attack?" Valerius ignored him. Slowly, deliberately, the Alpha King set his goblet on the wooden table. He stood up. He was no longer a bored ruler. He was a predator who had just caught a scent. His silver eyes swept the room. He bypassed the terrified nobles, bypassed the cowering warriors. His gaze sliced through the smoky air, tracking the invisible current of the draft, moving inexorably toward the back of the hall, toward the shadows, toward her. She pressed herself against the freezing stone, trying to meld into the masonry. Her heart was a war drum in her chest. "Look away," she prayed silently. "Look away." His eyes locked onto hers. The impact was physical. Across 100 feet of crowded, smoky space, the invisible tether snapped into existence. But it wasn't a fragile thread. It was a heavy, indestructible chain of pure iron slamming into her chest and locking shut. The hollowness that had consumed her for months vanished, replaced by a blinding, terrifying heat. Valerius didn't speak. He stepped down from the dais. The crowd parted before him like water fleeing a stone. Nobody breathed. The silence was agonizing. The only sound was the heavy thud of the king's boots on the flagstones. Kaelin was staring pale and confused, watching the most powerful man in the world walk away from his high table. Valerius stopped 10 feet from her alcove. The shadows couldn't hide her anymore. He was so close she could see the individual white hairs in his beard, the faint pulse at the base of his thick neck. He looked at her. He looked at her worn boots, her cheap tunic, the hollows of her cheeks, and the absolute terror in her eyes. He didn't see a discarded tracker. The reverence in his silver eyes was terrifying. "You," he rumbled. The word was a command and a prayer. She couldn't speak. Her mouth was dry. She forced herself to stand straight, refusing to cower, though every instinct screamed at her to bare her neck to him. "My king." Kaelin's voice called out from the dais, frantic and confused. "That is Mabel. She is of no consequence. A tracker. She is—" Valerius didn't even turn his head. He raised one massive hand, and his alpha command slammed into Kaelin like a physical blow. Silence. Kaelin choked, dropping to his knees, clutching his throat as the king's will forced him into submission. Rowena let out a small shriek of terror. Valerius took the final step, invading her space. He towered over her, a monolith of muscle and fur. He reached out. She flinched, bracing for violence, but his large, calloused hand cupped her jaw with shocking gentleness. His thumb brushed over the sharp line of her cheekbone. The heat of his skin sent a jolt of pure lightning straight down her spine. He leaned in his face, inches from hers. His breath was warm, smelling of dark wine and winter. "Mine." The Alpha King whispered the word, meant only for her, yet carrying the weight of a decree. Then he turned to the room. He kept his hand firmly on her jaw, a physical claim, before the terrified eyes of the pack that had watched her break. He looked directly at Kaelin, who was gasping on the floor, and then at the 300 wolves of Winterborn. "Bear witness!" Valerius roared his voice, shaking the dust from the rafters. "I claim this female. She is Mabel of Ethelgard, my fated mate, your queen." The silence in the great hall was absolute, heavy, and toxic. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. 300 wolves held their breath. On the floor, Kaelin was still on his hands and knees, fighting the crushing weight of the king's aura. Rowena had pressed herself back into the carved wood of the high seat, her hands trembling over her stomach, her eyes wide with a terror that stripped away her northern arrogance. Mabel stood frozen under Valerius's hand. The heat of his palm against her jaw was a physical anchor in a room that felt like it was spinning violently off its axis. Her mind was white noise. Queen! The word didn't fit in her mouth. It didn't fit in her reality. She was a tracker who traded dead foxes for salt. My king. Kaelin choked out. The pressure on his chest must have been immense, but the sheer panic of the situation forced the words past his teeth. She was my mate. I severed the bond. She is damaged goods, a reject of House Winterbourne. You cannot— Valerius turned his head just enough to look at Kaelin. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You speak of things you do not understand, boy. Valerius rumbled, the sound vibrating in the floorboards. You held a diamond in your hands and complained it was not a stone you could use to grind your grain. Your blindness is not her flaw. It is your failing. He dropped his hand from her jaw. She immediately missed the heat. He turned his massive frame fully towards the dais. The decennial tithe is cancelled for Winterbourne. The king declared, his voice cutting through the smoky air like a broad sword. Instead, I am taking my mate. You will forget her name. You will never speak of her. If I hear that the wolves of this valley utter so much as a whisper of disrespect towards the Queen of Ethelgard, I will return, and I will not leave a single stone of this hall standing. Am I understood? Kaelin swallowed his face, the colour of dirty snow. Yes, my king. Valerius looked down at her. The lethal, terrifying warlord vanished, replaced instantly by something dangerously close to gentle. Do you have belongings, Mabel? She blinked. Her vocal cords felt like sandpaper. A cabin. 3 miles out. My bow. My winter gear. Show my men. He gestured slightly. 4 of the massive black-armoured guards detached themselves from the wall and moved toward them. I can get them myself. She snapped a reflexive flare of independence cutting through her shock. She wasn't a prize to be packed up. She was still Mabel. Valerius didn't look angry. He looked amused. A tiny, barely visible smirk tugged at the scarred corner of his mouth. You are my mate. You do not carry your own burdens anymore. But if you wish to walk, we walk. He didn't wait for Kaelin to dismiss the feast. He didn't wait for pleasantries. He placed a heavy, warm hand against the small of her back and guided her toward the massive oak doors. The crowd parted, faces averted, staring at the floor. She walked past the women who had whispered about her at the trading post. She walked past the elders who had watched her bleed in the courtyard. She didn't look at them. She kept her eyes fixed on the heavy iron hinges of the doors. The winter air hit her like a slap when they stepped outside. The cold was instantly negated by the furnace-like heat radiating from the massive alpha walking beside her. His guards fell into a tight, protective diamond formation around them. 3 miles, she muttered, pointing toward the dark, jagged line of the eastern ridge. They walked in silence. The snow was deep, but Valerius moved through it like a glacier breaking the path. Her mind raced, trying to process the violent shift in her universe. A few hours ago, her biggest concern was making her salted pork last until spring. Now she was walking beside a living myth who claimed her soul belonged to him. Her chest ached. The old scar tissue from Kaelin's severing was pulling, reacting to the aggressive, possessive roots the new mate bond was trying to plant. It felt like someone trying to sew a fresh wound with rusty wire. She stumbled, pressing a hand to her sternum, a sharp hiss escaping her teeth. Valerius stopped instantly. You are in pain, he stated. It wasn't a question. I was severed 3 months ago. She said, her voice defensive, bracing for his disgust. Most wolves viewed a severed mate as cursed, fundamentally broken. My wolf is damaged. The bond you're pushing. It hurts. Valerius looked down at her, the moonlight catching the silver in his eyes. He didn't look disgusted. He looked furious, but the fury wasn't directed at her. He took a slow breath, visibly reining in his alpha aura, pulling it back until it was a low, warm hum rather than a crushing weight. I will not push, he said quietly. The bond will heal you, Mabel, but it will take time. I have waited 50 years for the goddess to give me a mate. I can wait a few more months for you to be ready." He took off his heavy bear fur cloak and draped it over her shoulders. It smelled of him pine ozone and power. The weight of it was grounding. "Show me this cabin," he commanded softly, "and then I am taking you home." The journey to Ethelgard took a week. They rode in a massive reinforced carriage lined with furs and heated by iron braziers. The King's Guard rode in a tight, impenetrable perimeter. Mabel spent the first 2 days waiting for the other shoe to drop. She sat on one side of the carriage wrapped in his cloak, watching him. She expected him to demand submission. She expected him to touch her, to enforce his claim the way warlords did in the old stories. He didn't. Valerius sat across from her reviewing maps and reading dispatches delivered by swift runners. He was a man accustomed to war logistics and absolute power, yet he made sure her cup of hot cider was never empty. When she slept exhausted by the chaotic healing of her internal bond, she would wake to find he had pulled an extra fur over her. On the 3rd night, they stopped at a fortified way station in the crags of the Bloodhorn Mountains. The wind screamed outside the thick stone walls, but the hearth fire inside was roaring. She sat on a wooden bench, staring into the flames. Valerius sat at a heavy table a few feet away, cleaning his broadsword with methodical, sweeping strokes of an oiled rag. "You're waiting for a trap," he said suddenly, not looking up from the steel. She stiffened. "I don't know what you mean. Your heart rate spikes whenever I look at you. You keep your back to the wall. You evaluate the exits whenever we enter a room." He noted his voice, a low, soothing rumble. "You are tracking me, Mabel, waiting for the predator to strike." She crossed her arms over her chest, defensive. "You're the Alpha King. You conquered the 7 territories by drowning them in blood. Forgive me if I don't believe you're just a gentle giant who wants a quiet domestic life." Valerius paused. He set the rag down and finally looked at her. The harsh light of the fire illuminated the deep scar on his face, making him look ruthless. "I am a killer," he agreed simply. "I killed my own brother to take the throne. I slaughtered the Eastern Rebellion down to the last pup to ensure 30 years of peace. I am not a good man, Mabel, but I am your mate." He stood up the sheer size of him, dwarfing the room, and walked over to the hearth. He stood beside her, staring into the fire. "When you are at the top of the world, everyone looks at you like you are a god, a monster, or a stepping stone," he said quietly. "Nobody looks at you like you are a person. For 50 years my wolf has howled in the dark, begging for the other half of our soul. The goddess made me wait. She made me forge a kingdom out of ash and bone first." He turned his head, his silver eyes locking onto hers. "Then I walked into a miserable dining hall in a miserable border town, and I smelled you. I smelled your pain. I smelled your defiance. Kaelin broke you because he was a coward who feared the work of building a kingdom with a partner who was his equal. He wanted a political tool. He wanted a broodmare." She flinched. The words were harsh, but they were true. They stripped away the last lingering illusion she had about her past. "You are not a prize I won, Mabel." Valerius continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You are the foundation I have been waiting for. I will not force you. I will not rush you. You will heal. You will stand beside me. And when you are ready, you will rule them all." She stared at him, her cynical heart searching for the lie in his eyes. There was none. There was only a terrifying, absolute certainty. For the first time in months, the ghost of her wolf stepped out of the shadows in her mind. She didn't cower. She sniffed the air, feeling the steady, unyielding strength of the ancient alpha standing beside them. "I don't know how to be a queen," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "You know how to track. You know how to survive." Valerius replied, reaching out. He didn't touch her face this time. He offered his massive hand palm up, leaving the choice to her. A royal court is just a forest full of predators with better manners. You will read their tracks, and I will execute the ones who bare their teeth." She looked at his hand. It was scarred, calloused, a map of violence. Slowly fighting the instinct to run, she uncrossed her arms. She reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers curled around hers, warm and infinitely secure. A jolt of pure energy raced up her arm, but it didn't hurt. It felt like coming in from the cold. "Okay," she whispered. They crested the final ridge on the 7th day. Below them lay the capital of the werewolf territories. Ethelgard was not a fairy tale city of white spires and banners. It was a fortress of black iron, heavy granite, and brutalist architecture built into the side of a massive dormant volcano. The city cascaded down the slopes in concentric rings of massive walls. Smoke poured from 100 forges. It smelled of sulfur-roasted meat and the overwhelming dense scent of 10,000 wolves. Mabel stood at the window of the carriage, her breath fogging the glass. Intimidating. Valerius noted from the seat opposite her. "It looks like a prison," she said honestly. He laughed, a deep, chest-rattling sound that startled the guards riding outside. "It is a prison. For the ambitious, the greedy, and the foolish. They all come here to steal a piece of my power, and they all end up trapped by their own politics." The gate's massive slabs of reinforced steel groaned open as the royal retinue approached. Horns blew from the watchtowers, a long, mournful sound that echoed off the mountain. The streets were immediately lined with citizens. They didn't cheer like peasants in a storybook. They watched in respectful, terrified silence, baring their necks as the carriage rumbled past. They climbed higher, passing through the merchant tier, the military barracks, and finally into the inner keep, the king's sanctum. The carriage halted in a massive courtyard paved with obsidian. A dozen high-ranking officials and commanders stood waiting in the freezing wind wrapped in silks and expensive furs. They looked like sharks circling a drop of blood. "Listen to me." Valerius said, his tone shifting instantly from companion to warlord. He leaned forward, catching her chin, forcing her to look him in the eye. "When we step out of this carriage, they will smell the severed bond on you. They will smell Kaelin's rejection before they smell my claim. They will look for weakness. If you show them a wounded tracker, they will eat you alive." Her pulse hammered in her throat. "What do I show them?" "Show them the wolf who survived the winter," he ordered. "Show them the mate of the Alpha King. Chin up, eyes flat. Do not bare your neck to anyone, not even me." He released her chin, pushed open the carriage door, and stepped out into the courtyard. She took a deep breath. She pushed the fear down deep into her belly. She anchored herself to the heavy, iron-clad presence of the bond tethering her to the king. She stepped out of the carriage. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She stood at Valerius's side. He immediately placed a heavy hand on the small of her back, a physical brand marking her as his. The officials dropped to their knees, a synchronized wave of submission. "Rise," Valerius commanded. They stood. Their eyes immediately darted to her. She watched their nostrils flare. She saw the exact moment they caught her scent. The confusion. The sharp tang of Kaelin's old rejection lingering under her skin, immediately followed by the overwhelming, possessive musk of the king's claim. A tall man with a scarred throat and eyes like chipped flint stepped forward. He wore the heavy silver chains of the king's vanguard. "My king!" The man rasped, bowing his head. "We did not expect your return so soon, and we did not expect you to return accompanied." "Commander Bram." Valerius greeted him coldly. "Prepare the royal wing. Convene the Elder Council for tonight. I have found my fated mate. Mabel of Ethelgard is your queen." Bram's eyes flicked to her. She saw the calculation in them. He was evaluating her worth, her threat level, her pedigree. He saw her worn leather boots, her plain tunic. He saw a peasant. A royal court is just a forest full of predators with better manners. Valerius's words echoed in her head. She didn't shrink. She didn't look away. She met Commander Bram's flinty stare with the same flat, dead-eyed gaze she used when staring down a cornered boar in the deep woods. She let the silence stretch, holding his eyes, refusing to be the first to look away. She watched the muscles in Bram's jaw tighten. She watched him realize that while she might not be dripping in gold, she wasn't prey. Slowly, deliberately, Bram lowered his chin, exposing his throat to her. It wasn't the deep bow he gave the king, but it was submission. "Welcome to Ironhold, my queen," Bram rasped. "Thank you, Commander," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the absolute terror vibrating in her bones. Valerius's hand tightened slightly on her back, a silent burst of pride flooding through their bond. They walked past the bowing lords and into the dark, cavernous maw of the keep. The doors slammed shut behind them, sealing her inside the most dangerous den in the kingdom. The tracker from Winterbourne was dead. The game had changed, and she fully intended to survive it. The Elder Council chamber of Ethelgard smelled like old dust, expensive ink, and concentrated malice. It was a circular room built into the highest peak of the keep, ringed with narrow windows that offered a dizzying view of the city below. A massive obsidian table occupied the center. Around it sat 12 of the most powerful wolves in the kingdom. They were warlords who had traded their broadswords for velvet doublets, and matriarchs who could order a bloodline eradicated between sips of tea. Mabel sat at Valerius's right hand. She was wearing a dress of midnight blue wool, tailored to her measurements by terrified seamstresses in a matter of hours. It was heavy restrictive, and hid the hunting knife she had strapped to her thigh. The council was not pleased. "It is a matter of precedent, my king," Lord Corrin was saying. He was an older wolf with a silver beard, and eyes like 2 pieces of chipped flint. He hadn't looked at her directly since the meeting began. "The Queen of Ethelgard must be of unbroken lineage. She must possess the political capital to unify the southern pacts. With respect, a severed female from a destitute border village brings nothing to the throne but a weak flank." Valerius leaned back in his massive chair. He didn't erupt. He didn't roar. He just watched Corrin with the detached interest of an executioner sharpening an axe. "My mate brings herself, Corrin." Valerius rumbled his voice, a low vibration that rattled the inkwells on the table. "That is the only capital required. The bond of the goddess is sacred, yes." Lady Beatrice interjected. She was a striking woman with iron-grey hair pulled into an intricate knot, her neck dripping with emeralds. "But human politics require more than divine intervention. A severed wolf is a wounded wolf. The kingdom needs a shield, not a liability." She finally turned her gaze to Mabel. It was a cold, calculating look, designed to strip her to the bone and find her lacking. "Tell me, Lady Mabel." Beatrice purred the title, sounding like an insult. "What experience do you have in managing the affairs of a kingdom? Have you ever negotiated a trade blockade? Have you ever commanded a siege?" Mabel felt the eyes of the room snap to her. The heavy silence fell suffocating and expectant. Valerius shifted slightly, a subtle tensing of his jaw. He was preparing to step in to crush Beatrice with his alpha command. She reached under the table and placed her hand firmly over his knee. The muscle beneath the thick fabric was coiled like steel wire. She gave it a single sharp squeeze. "Let me." She kept her hand there, drawing on the steady volcanic heat of his bond, and looked directly at Beatrice. She didn't try to mimic their aristocratic posture. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the cold obsidian table. She looked at the faint yellow stain on Corrin's index finger nicotine from a specific pipeweed grown only in the eastern valleys. She looked at the slight tremor in Beatrice's left hand, hidden beneath her lace cuffs, a sign of failing nerve or perhaps early sickness. She looked at the microscopic scuff marks on the boots of the general sitting to her left, indicating he had recently walked through the lower-tier slaughterhouses rather than his pristine barracks. They weren't untouchable gods. They were just animals in a different kind of forest. "I have never commanded a siege, Lady Beatrice," she said. Her voice was level, carrying easily in the quiet room. "I have never negotiated a blockade. You are right. I am a tracker. My expertise lies in knowing when a predator is desperate, when it is lying, and when it is preparing to strike." She shifted her gaze to Lord Corin. "For instance, I know that Lord Corin is currently terrified. He imports Eastern pipeweed, a trade route heavily taxed by the Crown. He fears a new queen from the West might advocate for a shift in trade tariffs, crippling his personal wealth." Corin's face drained of colour. He opened his mouth, then snapped it shut, his eyes darting to Valerius. She turned back to Beatrice. "And I know that you, Lady Beatrice, are masking a scent of sour milk and iron. Your youngest son, the one commanding the northern garrison, was injured last week, in a skirmish you haven't reported to the king yet. You're delaying because you want to handle it quietly, preserving your family's reputation for invulnerability." Beatrice's jaw actually dropped. The emeralds at her throat clattered softly against her collarbone as her breathing hitched. Mabel leaned back, her expression flat. "I don't know how to run a kingdom, but I know how to read the mud. I know how to spot a lie. And I know that if any of you bare your teeth at me again under the guise of political concern, I won't bother negotiating. I will simply tell my mate exactly where you sleep." The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the terrified, forced silence that Valerius commanded. It was the shocked, primal silence of a pack that had just realized the new wolf in the pen had fangs. Valerius let out a low, gravelly chuckle. It was a terrifying sound. He looked around the table at his stunned council, a dark pride burning in his silver eyes. "Are there any further concerns regarding the Queen's qualifications?" the king asked softly. Nobody spoke. "Excellent," Valerius said, standing up. "We are done here." He offered her his hand. She took it, letting him pull her from the chair. They walked out of the chamber together, leaving the 12 most powerful nobles in Ethelgard sitting in paralyzed silence. As the heavy doors shut behind them, she let out a long, shaky breath, her knees suddenly feeling like water. Valerius stopped in the stone corridor. He turned to her, his massive hands catching her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "Sour milk and iron," he murmured, a smile tugging at his scarred mouth. "She tried to mask it with lavender," she said, leaning her forehead against his chest plate, listening to the heavy, steady thud of his heart. "It didn't work. You are a terrifying creature, Mabel of Winterbourne." "I told you," she whispered. "I'm a survivor." His hands slid up her back, broad and warm, anchoring her. The dull ache in her chest, the lingering phantom pain of Kaelin's rejection, suddenly flared, not with agony, but with heat. It was the sensation of dead wood catching fire. The severed bond wasn't just healing. It was being incinerated, replaced by something ancient, indestructible, and deep. Her wolf stretched in her mind. For the first time in months, she let out a low, content rumble. The royal mating ceremony was set for the night of the full moon, 2 weeks after their arrival. It was a mandatory summons for every regional alpha. They were required to come to Ironhold, bend the knee, and bleed into the ancestral chalice to swear fealty to the new queen, which meant Kaelin was coming. Mabel spent the 2 weeks preparing. She didn't study etiquette. She trained with Commander Bram in the royal courtyards. She wanted her muscles sharp. She wanted her reflexes flawless. The aristocracy of Ethelgard watched her throw knives into wooden targets from 50 paces, their whispers slowly changing from derision to a wary, creeping respect. Valerius gave her space when she needed it, and his presence when she didn't know how to ask for it. He was a ruthless warlord to his enemies, but to her he was a massive, impenetrable wall against the cold. The nights were the hardest. The phantom pains of the severed bond would sometimes wake her in a cold sweat, her chest tight with old trauma. Valerius would wake instantly. He wouldn't offer empty platitudes. He would simply pull her against his side, wrap his heavy arms around her, and flood the room with his calming, pine-scented alpha aura until her breathing matched his. He was rewriting her nervous system one quiet night at a time. On the eve of the ceremony, the keep was a madhouse of arriving dignitaries. She was walking through the lower eastern corridor, returning from the armory with a newly balanced blade, when the scent hit her. It wasn't the overwhelming, suffocating pull of a mate bond. It was the smell of damp wool wood smoke and a faint underlying desperation. She stopped. Standing at the end of the stone hallway, arguing with a pair of royal guards, was Kaelin. Rowena stood slightly behind him, heavily pregnant, looking exhausted and terrified by the imposing black stone architecture of the capital. "I am the Alpha of Winterborn." Kaelin was snapping, though his voice lacked its usual authority. It sounded thin, strained. "I demand a better suite. My Luna is with child. She cannot climb 5 flights of stairs to the servant tiers. Your suite is assigned according to your pack's standing Alpha." The guard replied with dead-eyed indifference. "Winterborn has produced no tribute and commands 0 strategic value. You are housed in the rookery wing." She could have turned around. She could have walked away and let him suffer the humiliation. But the ghost of the girl who had bled in the mud of his courtyard demanded a funeral. She stepped out of the shadows. "Is there a problem, guardsman?" she asked. Her voice echoed slightly off the stone. Kaelin froze. He turned slowly, his eyes widening. She didn't look like the girl he had discarded. She wore fitted leather armor dyed the crimson of the royal house, a silver clasp holding a cloak of black wolf fur at her shoulder. Her hair was braided back tight and severe. The hollowness in her cheeks had been filled with solid muscle and the radiant health of a king's bond. Rowena gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She looked at Mabel, then looked down at her own swollen, cumbersome form, a sudden flash of profound insecurity crossing her face. "Mabel." Kaelin breathed. He took a step forward, a bizarre mix of awe and old possession flickering in his eyes. He actually reached out a hand. You look—" She didn't move. She just looked at his outstretched hand until he realized what he was doing and let it drop awkwardly to his side. "I am not Mabel to you," she said softly. She didn't project anger. She didn't have any left for him. She felt nothing but a vague, clinical pity. "I am your queen. Address me accordingly, Kaelin." He flushed a deep, ugly red. His pride warred with his survival instinct. The survival instinct won. He lowered his head, exposing his neck. "My queen, we apologize. We were only requesting adequate housing for my Luna. Winterborn is failing, Kaelin," she stated plainly. "I saw the trade reports in the council chambers yesterday. The northern warlords, Rowena's father included, have cut your supply lines now that the king stripped your tithe exemption. Your people will starve by February." Kaelin's head snapped up. Desperation broke through his facade. "You know this. Mabel, please. You grew up there. You know those people. You can speak to the king. You can ask him to reinstate our trade routes. We were mates once." It was the most pathetic thing she had ever witnessed. He was using the bond he had violently severed to beg for scraps from the table he had thrown her off of. He was hoping to find the soft, devoted girl who used to track elk for his father. "We were never mates, Kaelin," she said, her voice dropping to a chill that rivaled the winter winds. "The goddess put me in your path to test your character. You failed. You chose a dowry over a soul. You chose a northern army over a partner." She stepped closer to him. He flinched, shrinking back against the stone wall. She let a fraction of the power Valerius had poured into her bleed out into her aura. It wasn't the crushing weight of the king, but it was enough to make Kaelin's knees buckle slightly. "I will not punish Winterborn for your stupidity," she told him, looking down into his wide, terrified eyes. I have already arranged for grain shipments to be sent before the first snow, but it will not be sent to you. It will be managed by old Garrick. You are a figurehead now, Kaelin. You rule nothing." She turned her eyes to Rowena. She was weeping silently, clutching her belly. Mabel felt no triumph in her tears, just a profound sadness for the cycle of it all. "Enjoy the rookery wing," she said. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away. Her chest didn't ache, her hands didn't shake. The tether connecting her to her past simply dissolved into dust, blowing away on the draft of the stone corridor. She was finally entirely free. The great hall of Ethelgard was 10 times the size of Winterbourne's a cavernous cathedral of black iron and roaring fire. 10,000 wolves filled the amphitheatre tiers, a sea of shifting eyes and suppressed predatory energy. At the center of the room lay the moonstone, a massive slab of white quartz, worn smooth by centuries of blood and ritual. Mabel stood at the edge of the dais, wrapped in a ceremonial cloak of pure white fur. The noise in the hall was deafening, a low, continuous roar of thousands of conversations, arguments, and speculations. They were waiting to see if the severed tracker would break under the pressure of the crown. Valerius stood at the altar. He wore no armor tonight. He wore simple black linen trousers and a heavy silver torque around his thick neck. The scars on his chest and arms were a roadmap of his violent ascension. He was magnificent, a brutal, ancient god of war waiting for her. Commander Bram struck a massive iron gong. The sound reverberated through the floorboards, sinking into the bones of every wolf present. The hall fell instantly, terrifyingly silent. "The right of claiming begins—" Bram roared, his harsh voice echoing into the rafters. She stepped forward. The walk from the edge of the dais to the moonstone felt like a mile. She kept her eyes fixed on Valerius. His silver eyes locked onto hers, a steady burning beacon in the sea of hostile faces. He didn't smile, but the bond between them hummed with a fierce, protective pride. She reached the altar. The high priest, an ancient wolf, blind in both eyes, stepped forward, holding a ceremonial dagger made of dragon glass. "Valerius of Ethelgard." The priest chanted, his voice a dry rasp. "Do you offer your blood, your beast, and your crown to this female?" Valerius held out his hand. He didn't take the dagger. He simply drew his own thumb across the sharp edge of his broadsword, resting on the altar, opening a deep gash. He held his bleeding hand over the quartz basin. "I offer my blood. I offer my beast. I offer my crown." Valerius rumbled the sheer volume of his voice, making the front rows flinch. "She is my anchor. She is my equal. I am hers until the mountain crumbles." The priest turned to her. The blind eyes seemed to look right through her skull. "Mabel of the Western Ridge," the priest said. "Do you accept this blood? Do you offer your own? Can a severed spirit bear the weight of the Alpha King?" A murmur ran through the crowd at the mention of her severed status. A ripple of doubt. Lord Corrin, sitting in the front row, leaned forward with a look of hungry anticipation. They were waiting for her to falter. They were waiting for her damaged wolf to reject the overwhelming power of the king's blood. She looked at the dagger the priest offered. She didn't take it. She reached down to her thigh and drew her own hunting knife, the iron blade she had traded 3 fox pelts for in a frozen village months ago. The blade that had kept her alive in the bleeding season. She held out her hand over the basin directly beneath Valerius's. Their eyes met. "I am a survivor," she told him through the bond. "You are a queen," he replied. She gripped the blade of the hunting knife and pulled. The iron sliced deep into her palm. The pain was sharp, grounding, and absolutely beautiful. She squeezed her fist, letting her blood rain down into the basin, mixing with the dark, heavy blood of the Alpha King. The reaction was instantaneous. When the blood of true fated mates mixes, it doesn't just sit in the bowl. A violent, blinding flash of ethereal white light erupted from the quartz. It shot upward, a pillar of pure, concentrated energy that illuminated the dark rafters of the great hall. But it wasn't just light. It was a shockwave. Her wolf, the broken, battered creature that had curled up to die in the winter snow, tore free from the confines of her mind. She didn't whimper. She didn't hide. She threw her head back and unleashed a howl that ripped through the physical world. It wasn't a sound of pain. It was a war cry. The shockwave hit the crowd. The sheer terrifying magnitude of their combined aura blasted outward. In the front row, Lord Corrin was physically thrown back into his seat, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Lady Beatrice dropped to her knees, gasping for air. Behind them, 10,000 wolves collapsed to the stone floor in a domino effect of immediate involuntary submission. Even Commander Bram hit the deck, his forehead pressed to the obsidian tiles. The only two people standing in the entire hall were Mabel and Valerius. The light faded, leaving a heavy ozone-scented smoke in the air. The silence was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Valerius reached across the altar. He took her bleeding hand in his. He didn't care about the blood. He lifted her hand to his mouth and kissed the open wound, sealing the bond, sealing her soul to his forever. He turned to the sea of kneeling bodies. "Behold your queen!" The Alpha King roared a sound of absolute, unyielding triumph. She looked out at the thousands of bowed heads. She looked at the nobles who had tried to break her, the generals who had doubted her, and the ghosts of her past that could no longer touch her. She squeezed Valerius's hand, the iron strength of him flowing into her veins. She didn't need to learn how to be a royal. She just needed to remember how to be a wolf. What an absolute journey of betrayal, survival, and ultimate redemption. Mabel's evolution from a discarded, severed tracker in the freezing mud to the terrifyingly powerful Queen of Ethelgard proves that sometimes you have to be broken to be rebuilt stronger. She didn't just survive Kaelin's cruelty. She thrived finding an Alpha King who recognized that a woman's scars are her crown. If you loved the gritty politics, the slow burn healing, and that explosive coronation scene, smash that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic, grounded werewolf dramas.